The year is 1991. A Soviet engineer named Viktor Petrov sits in his Moscow apartment, cup of tea growing cold in his hands, watching CNN broadcast live footage of American F-117 Nighthawk stealth fighters flying unopposed through Iraqi airspace. Below them, S-300 surface-to-air missile systems, the pride of Soviet engineering, sit silent, not damaged, not destroyed, simply irrelevant. In this moment, Victor realizes something that will haunt him for the rest of his life. The system he helped design, the system his country claimed was invincible, the system that was supposed to prove Soviet technological superiority to the world, cannot see the enemy. 40 years of Cold War certainty, evaporating in real time on American television. This is not a story about missiles. This is a story about the moment an entire worldview collided with televised reality. About what happens when your life's work becomes evidence of your nation's obsolescence, and about the gap between what we're told is true and what is measurably, demonstrably, undeniably real. To understand what Viktor Petrov felt watching those broadcasts, you first need to understand what Soviet engineers believed. Not hoped, not suspected, believed. They believed Soviet air defense technology was the most sophisticated on Earth. This wasn't propaganda they were fed. This was their daily reality. They had built the systems. They knew the mathematics, they understood the physics of radar cross-sections, the geometry of missile intercepts, the elegant complexity of tracking algorithms that could follow dozens of targets simultaneously. The S-300 system represented the culmination of decades of focused engineering effort. Multiple radar bands working in concert, missiles capable of engaging targets at altitudes from treetop level to the edge of space. Fire control systems that could prioritize threats and allocate resources with ruthless efficiency. On paper, in simulations, in test after test conducted at proving grounds across the Soviet Union, the system worked flawlessly. They believed the Americans might have better marketing, flashier press releases, more Hollywood footage of their weapons. But when it came to actual engineering, particularly in the unglamorous, mathematically demanding field of air defense, Soviet systems were supreme. They believed this because they had evidence. Their systems had been exported to dozens of countries. They had downed aircraft in regional conflicts. They had earned respect from Western military planners who designed entire operational doctrines around avoiding or suppressing Soviet surface-to-air missiles. They believed this because it had to be true. Because if it wasn't true, then what had they spent their careers building? What had their country sacrificed so much to develop? January 17, 1991. Operation Desert Storm begins. Viktor Petrov, like millions of others around the world, watches CNN's unprecedented live coverage of modern warfare. But Viktor isn't watching the way most viewers watch. He's not awed by the spectacle or stirred by the narrative of liberation. He's watching with the specific, horrified attention of someone who recognizes the equipment on the screen. He sees the distinctive profile of S-300 launchers in Iraqi defensive positions. He knows every component of those systems because he helped refine them. He knows the radar should be detecting incoming aircraft at ranges exceeding 100 kilometers. He knows the fire control computers should be generating intercept solutions. He knows the missiles should be launching. Nothing happens. The American aircraft, flying in formations that should be lighting up every radar screen in Iraq like Christmas trees, pass through defensive zones as if those zones don't exist. The S-300 systems, along with their older cousins, the SA-2s, SA-3s, SA-6s, the entire integrated air defense network that Iraq had spent billions of dollars building, sit inert. Not because they've been destroyed in opening strikes. Many of them haven't been touched. They sit silent because they cannot see the threat. The F-117 Nighthawk wasn't a beautiful aircraft. Unlike the sweeping curves of Soviet fighters or the purposeful aggression of American air superiority jets, the Nighthawk looked like something assembled from flat panels and odd angles, like a flying abstraction of an airplane rather than the real thing. Soviet engineers had seen the photographs, read the limited technical intelligence available, and largely dismissed it. Yes, the Americans had clearly put effort into reducing radar signature, but the fundamental physics of radar detection couldn't be cheated. Large objects reflect electromagnetic radiation. This was not a matter of opinion, it was physics, or so they thought. The F-117's designers at Lockheed's Skunk Works had approached the problem differently. They hadn't tried to make the aircraft invisible. They had tried to make it undetectable, which is not the same thing. Every surface angled precisely to deflect radar waves away from their source. Radar-absorbent materials coating the airframe. Engine inlets shielded to prevent radar returns from the compressor fans. Even the weapons carried internally to prevent any protruding surfaces that might catch and return a signal. The result was an aircraft with a radar cross-section smaller than a bird. Soviet radars were looking for the electromagnetic equivalent of a truck. The F-117 was showing up on their screens as the equivalent of a sparrow, if it showed up at all. And the signal processing software, designed to filter out birds, filtered out the Nighthawk. Victor watches the CNN footage, and with each hour of broadcasts, his understanding of the technical gap grows more precise and more devastating. The Americans aren't just winning, they're demonstrating a capability the Soviet Union had failed to anticipate, failed to counter, and failed even to believe was possible. This wasn't like discovering your opponent had a slightly better tank or a faster fighter. This was discovering that your opponent had been playing an entirely different game while you perfected the rules of the old one. The television shows precision-guided munitions hitting targets with accuracy that Soviet doctrine said was impossible. Soviet military planning assumed circular error probable measurements in hundreds of meters for most weapons. The Americans are hitting targets with circular error probable measurements in single-digit meters. The television shows American aircraft operating at night with the same effectiveness as day operations. Soviet forces had planned to use darkness as a defensive measure, knowing it would degrade American targeting. But the Americans have forward-looking infrared systems, night vision technology, and targeting pods that make darkness irrelevant. The television shows command and control networks functioning seamlessly across hundreds of kilometers. The Americans are coordinating airstrikes, artillery, ground movements, and intelligence in real time. Soviet doctrine had assumed that modern warfare would fragment into isolated battles once communications were disrupted. The Americans have built a system where disrupting any single node doesn't collapse the network. But it's the silence of the S-300 systems that haunts Victor most, because he understands what that silence means in ways the CNN commentators cannot. The S-300 wasn't just a weapon system, it was proof of concept for Soviet defensive doctrine. The Soviet Union couldn't match American military spending dollar for dollar. They couldn't build as many aircraft carriers, or deploy as many fighters, or maintain as many overseas bases. But they could, Soviet planners believed, make their airspace so dangerous that American quantitative advantages would be neutralized. An S-300 battery cost perhaps $20 million. An American fighter cost $40 million. An American bomber cost hundreds of millions. If Soviet air defenses could force the Americans to lose aircraft at even modest rates, the economic calculus of any conflict would favor the Soviet Union. The entire defensive posture of the Warsaw Pact depended on this mathematics working. And now on CNN, Victor watches that mathematics fail in the most public, most undeniable way possible. The silence of those S-300 systems isn't just a tactical failure. It's the collapse of strategic theory. There's a particular kind of pain that comes from expert knowledge in moments like this. A civilian watching the Gulf War might see impressive American technology. Victor sees the systematic dismantling of everything his professional community believed about modern warfare. When an F-117 drops a bomb through the roof of a hardened aircraft shelter in Baghdad, Victor knows that shelter was built to Soviet specifications. He knows the hardening calculations, the concrete thickness, the assumptions about weapon effects. He knows that shelter should survive anything except a direct hit with the heaviest bunker-penetrating weapons. He watches American 2,000-pound laser-guided bombs defeat those shelters routinely, almost casually. When American F-15 fighters establish air superiority over Iraq in the opening days, Victor knows Iraqi pilots were trained in Soviet doctrine. He knows the tactics they're using because those tactics were developed at Soviet academies and refined in Soviet exercises. He watches those tactics become suicide against American beyond visual range missiles and situational awareness. When American A-10 Warthog ground attack aircraft destroy Iraqi armor formations, Victor knows that armor was designed specifically to defeat NATO anti-tank weapons. He knows the reactive armor specifications, the composite armor layouts, the protection levels that should keep those tanks survivable on a modern battlefield. He watches American depleted uranium rounds punch through that armor as if it was sheet metal. This is where we need to slow down and understand something about institutional knowledge and personal identity. Viktor Petrov wasn't just any engineer. He was a specialist in radar signal processing, a man who had devoted 30 years to the problem of detecting and tracking aerial targets in complex electromagnetic environments. He had published papers. He had mentored younger engineers. He had earned respect within the Soviet defense establishment as someone who understood the deep mathematics of air defense. His sense of professional identity, his understanding of his place in the world, was built on the foundation of his expertise. And expertise means you don't just know facts, it means you have internalized a way of seeing the world. Victor looked at radar equations and saw truth as fundamental as gravity. He looked at signal-to-noise ratios and saw the immutable limits of what was possible. When you tell someone like Victor that American stealth technology makes his life's work obsolete, you're not just contradicting his opinion, you're attacking his entire framework for understanding reality. The natural human response is rejection. The evidence must be wrong, the situation must be unusual, there must be an explanation that preserves the existing worldview, except Victor has access to something most people defending failed worldviews don't have. He has CNN, broadcasting evidence in real time, evidence that cannot be explained away. The Soviet military establishment's response to the Gulf War demonstrates how institutions handle information that contradicts core beliefs. Initial reactions from military commentators in Moscow expressed confidence that Iraq's defeat was due to poor training, incompetent leadership, and outdated export versions of Soviet equipment. These explanations were comforting. They preserved the essential narrative. Soviet equipment wasn't inferior. It was misused. Soviet doctrine wasn't flawed. It was misapplied. Soviet air defense technology wasn't obsolete. It was sabotaged by incompetent operators. Victor knew better. He had access to the technical specifications of what Iraq had purchased. He knew their S-300 systems weren't ancient export models. They were relatively recent production. He knew Iraqi operators had received training from Soviet advisors. He knew the doctrine being followed was standard Soviet doctrine. The comfortable explanations didn't survive scrutiny. As weeks passed and more detailed analyses of the Gulf War emerged, some Soviet military analysts began acknowledging the scope of American technological advantage. But even these acknowledgments often came wrapped in qualifications. Yes, American stealth technology was effective, but it was expensive and could only be produced in small numbers. Yes, American precision-guided munitions were accurate, but they required elaborate support infrastructure. Yes, American information networks were impressive, but they were vulnerable to disruption. These qualifications weren't entirely wrong. But they missed the larger point. The Americans had identified the future character of warfare and built their military to fight that future war. The Soviets had perfected systems designed for the previous war. Let's examine what the S-300 system was designed to do, because understanding its design philosophy reveals the conceptual gap. Soviet air defense planners in the 1970s anticipated that any major conflict with NATO would involve large strike packages of American aircraft flying at medium to high altitudes, potentially dozens of aircraft in coordinated formations, attempting to penetrate Soviet airspace to strike strategic targets. The S-300 was designed to engage such threats at long range, to thin those strike packages before they could deliver their weapons. Its radar systems were optimized to detect and track aircraft with typical radar cross-sections of 5 to 10 square meters. Its missiles were designed with the kinematics to intercept fast-moving targets at ranges up to 100 kilometers. Its fire control computers could handle multiple simultaneous engagements. Against the threat it was designed to counter, the S-300 was formidable. But the Americans hadn't sent large strike packages of conventional aircraft flying at medium altitude. They had sent small numbers of stealth aircraft flying individually, with radar cross-sections measured in hundreds of square meters. They had sent cruise missiles launched from standoff range. They had sent electronic warfare aircraft that could identify and jam specific radar frequencies. They had sent anti-radiation missiles that could home in on active radar emissions. The entire American approach to suppression of enemy air defenses had evolved specifically to negate systems like the S-300, and the Soviets, focused on perfecting their existing approach, had failed to anticipate the evolution. Victor watches CNN and sees something else, something that perhaps bothers him even more than the technical failures. He sees the confidence of American military planners who clearly knew their systems would work. This wasn't bravado or propaganda. This was the confidence of engineers and commanders who had tested their equipment, understood its capabilities, and trusted it to perform. The Americans had built stealth fighters in secret, tested them extensively, refined the technology, and then deployed them operationally only when they were certain of the results. That kind of institutional patience, that kind of methodical development, spoke to a system that valued actual performance over impressive specifications. Soviet military development, particularly in its final decades, had often prioritized meeting quantitative goals: produce a certain number of tanks, reach a specific missile range, achieve a particular radar detection distance. Whether those systems worked reliably in complex operational environments, whether they could be maintained by conscript soldiers, whether they addressed actual tactical needs, these questions sometimes received less attention than the headline numbers. The result was a military that looked formidable in parades and on paper, but whose actual combat effectiveness was uncertain. The Gulf War removed that uncertainty. Iraqi forces, equipped and trained largely by the Soviets, faced an American military at the peak of its Cold War development. The result wasn't a battle, it was a demonstration of categorical advantage. Consider the psychological weight of expertise in a collapsing system. Victor knows that within the Soviet defense establishment, there are hundreds of engineers like him, specialists who have devoted careers to specific technical problems. There are the designers of Soviet fighter aircraft, watching their planes perform poorly against American counterparts. There are the developers of Soviet tank technology, seeing their armor defeated by weapons that shouldn't be able to penetrate it. There are the theorists who developed Soviet operational doctrine, watching that doctrine fail catastrophically. Each of these people faces the same crisis Victor faces. Their expertise remains. They still understand the technical details of their fields. But the framework within which that expertise was developed, the assumptions that guided their work, have been revealed as fundamentally flawed. And here's what makes this particularly painful. They can't even take refuge in the excuse that the Soviet Union collapsed before they could finish their work. The Gulf War happens in 1991. Soviet defense industries are still functioning. Soviet weapons are still being produced. The systems that fail in Iraq aren't ancient relics. They're the products of ongoing Soviet military development. There's no comfortable historical distance. The failure is immediate, contemporary, undeniable. The CNN broadcasts continue day after day, each one bringing new evidence of the technical gap. American Apache helicopters using thermal imaging to destroy Iraqi armor at night. American AWACS aircraft coordinating air operations across the entire theater. American J-STARS aircraft tracking ground movements in real time. American Patriot missiles, themselves a surface-to-air missile system, successfully intercepting Iraqi Scud missiles in flight. This last one particularly stings. The Soviets had pioneered ballistic missile technology. They had built ICBMs, IRBMs, SRBMs, an entire family of missiles that were supposed to represent one of their core technical strengths. And now an American system is shooting down ballistic missiles, performing a task Soviet engineers had considered theoretically possible but practically unfeasible. The technical details matter here. Intercepting a ballistic missile requires detecting the launch, calculating the trajectory, positioning an interceptor, guiding that interceptor to an intercept point, and achieving a kinetic kill against a small, fast-moving target. Each step requires sensor accuracy, computational power, and guidance precision at the absolute limits of what's achievable. The fact that American systems can do this operationally, not just in carefully controlled tests, but in combat conditions with real consequences, demonstrates a level of technical sophistication that Soviet systems simply haven't reached. Victor's apartment becomes a kind of vigil. He watches the broadcasts compulsively, not out of enjoyment, but out of a need to witness. Other Soviet engineers are watching too. They talk in careful, quiet conversations at institutes and research facilities. They don't talk about it openly in official meetings because the implications are too large, too potentially dangerous. But in private conversations, over drinks, in laboratories after hours, they discuss what they're seeing. Some maintain denial. They insist the Gulf War is a unique situation, that Iraqi incompetence explains everything, that Soviet forces would perform differently. Victor knows these people aren't stupid. They're protecting themselves psychologically. Accepting the truth means accepting that their careers have been spent on systems that were already obsolete, that their country is losing a technological race it didn't even realize it was running, that the sacrifices the Soviet people made to fund military development have purchased an illusion of strength rather than actual capability. But some of Victor's colleagues do accept the evidence. These conversations are the hardest. One of his friends, a specialist in missile guidance systems, admits that Soviet technology is perhaps a generation behind American equivalents in key areas. Microelectronics, computing power, sensor miniaturization. These aren't glamorous fields. They don't produce the kind of headline capabilities that impress military parades, but they're foundational. A fighter aircraft's performance depends not just on its engine or its weapons, but on the quality of its avionics, its radar, its fire control computer. A missile's effectiveness depends not just on its motor or its warhead, but on the precision of its guidance, the sophistication of its seeker, the reliability of its electronics. In these foundational areas, the Gulf War reveals, the Soviets have fallen behind. This is the moment to explore a deeper question. How does a nation, particularly one with the Soviet Union's technical capabilities and educational system, fall behind in such critical areas? The Soviet Union had world-class mathematicians, physicists, and engineers. It had universities that produced brilliant graduates. It had research institutes with talented people working on cutting-edge problems. The answer lies not in the people, but in the system. Soviet military development operated under constraints that gradually degraded its effectiveness. There was the ideological requirement to demonstrate superiority, which sometimes meant prioritizing impressive specifications over practical functionality. There was the centralized planning system, which made rapid adaptation to new technical developments difficult. There was the paranoid secrecy, which prevented the kind of open collaboration that accelerates innovation. There was the resource allocation, which often favored quantity over quality, numbers of systems over refinement of capabilities. And perhaps most critically, there was the isolation from feedback. American military systems went through cycles of development, testing, operational deployment, analysis of performance, and refinement. The process was wasteful and expensive, but it produced systems that actually worked in complex environments. Soviet systems often went from development to production with limited operational testing. Performance in carefully controlled conditions was assumed to translate to performance in combat. The Gulf War demonstrated that this assumption was wrong. Victor begins to understand that what he's watching isn't just military defeat. It's the collapse of Soviet modernity. The Soviet Union had defined itself, particularly in the Cold War era, as the future. Scientific socialism, rational planning, dialectical materialism, these weren't just political slogans, they were claims about the nature of progress. The Soviet system was supposed to be more efficient, more rational, more advanced than the chaotic capitalism of the West. Soviet education was supposed to produce better engineers. Soviet science was supposed to make faster breakthroughs. Soviet planning was supposed to allocate resources more intelligently, and Soviet technology, particularly military technology, was supposed to be at minimum equal to, and preferably superior to anything the West could produce. The Gulf War invalidates these claims in the most visible way possible. The American military, product of democratic capitalism, educated by universities that mixed research with commercial interests, equipped by defense contractors, that operated for profit, organized in a system that valued initiative over obedience, has achieved technological capabilities that the Soviet system cannot match. This isn't a matter of one side getting lucky or the other making mistakes. This is systematic advantage, the result of different approaches to innovation, development, and deployment. The Soviet approach, for all its apparent rationality and control, has produced inferior results. The psychological impact of this realization varies among the people Victor talks to. Some become bitter, angry at leadership that they feel misled them about Soviet capabilities. Some become cynical, concluding that all the sacrifices demanded of the Soviet people were for nothing. Some become curious, wanting to understand how the Americans achieved what they achieved, hoping that Soviet systems can learn and adapt. Victor himself oscillates between these reactions. There are days when he's angry, days when he's depressed, days when he throws himself into technical problems, hoping that work can provide distraction. But underlying everything is a profound sense of loss, not loss of illusions. He's too honest with himself to mourn those. Loss of time, loss of potential, loss of what could have been achieved if the Soviet system had operated differently. He thinks about the talented people he's worked with over the years, brilliant minds that were constrained by bureaucracy, limited by lack of resources, forced to work in isolation from international scientific community. He thinks about the projects that were cancelled for political rather than technical reasons. He thinks about the innovations that were proposed but rejected because they didn't fit with existing doctrine or threatened established bureaucracies. He thinks about all the ways the system sabotaged itself. The broadcasts continue. By late February, the ground war begins. Victor watches American armored formations move through Iraqi defenses with speed that Soviet doctrine said was impossible. Deep operations theory, developed by Soviet military thinkers, emphasized rapid penetration and exploitation of breakthrough. But Soviet equipment and logistics never quite managed to achieve what the theory described. The Americans, who supposedly didn't understand maneuver warfare, execute deep operations flawlessly. Their tanks move hundreds of kilometers. Their logistics keep pace. Their air support coordinates seamlessly with ground movements. Their commanders adapt to fluid situations with initiative that Soviet command structures would never permit. In 100 hours, American and coalition forces destroy or capture essentially the entire Iraqi military. Tank divisions cease to exist. Air defense networks go silent. Command structures collapse. This isn't defeat. This is erasure. And Victor, watching from Moscow, understands that every Iraqi unit was organized on Soviet principles. Using Soviet equipment, following Soviet doctrine. The defeat of Iraq is a demonstration of what would happen if Soviet forces faced American forces in conventional conflict. The nuclear deterrent remains, of course. The Soviet Union still possesses thousands of nuclear weapons that can destroy any adversary. But as a conventional military power, as an institution capable of projecting force and protecting interests through non-nuclear means, the Soviet military has been revealed as obsolete. We need to examine the human cost of this realization. Victor is not unusual. Across the Soviet military-industrial complex, there are tens of thousands of people whose professional identities are built around Soviet military capability. There are generals who have spent careers developing operational plans. There are factory managers who have spent decades producing weapon systems. There are political officers who have taught that Soviet military power guaranteed the nation's security and the revolution's future. The Gulf War doesn't just make their work obsolete, it makes it a source of vulnerability. Because the illusion of Soviet strength had value, it deterred aggression, it gave Soviet diplomacy weight, it provided domestic legitimacy to a system that demanded sacrifices in the name of national defense. Once that illusion is shattered, once the actual gap between Soviet and American capabilities becomes undeniable, the Soviet position in the world becomes precarious, and everyone in the military-industrial complex understands this. They understand that their failure, their inability to match American technological development, has strategic consequences. Some handle this by redirecting blame. They blame Gorbachev for weakening the military. They blame Perestroika for disrupting production. They blame traitors and saboteurs. These explanations are comforting because they locate the failure outside the system itself, in specific individuals or policies that can theoretically be reversed. But people like Victor, who understand the technical details, know that the problems are deeper and older than Gorbachev or Perestroika. The problems are systemic, the result of decades of accumulated dysfunction. The Soviet Union will collapse by the end of 1991, just months after the Gulf War. Historians debate the causes of that collapse, pointing to economic stagnation, political liberalization, nationalist movements, the loss of ideological legitimacy, Gorbachev's reforms, Reagan's military buildup. The list goes on. But for people like Victor, the Gulf War serves as a moment of clarification. It strips away the remaining pretense that the Soviet system works, that Soviet technology is competitive, that Soviet sacrifices have purchased actual strength rather than the appearance of strength. This isn't what causes the collapse. The structural problems long predate the Gulf War. But it's the moment when denial becomes impossible. Some Soviet military observers try to learn from the Gulf War. They study American tactics. They analyze the technology. They propose reforms to Soviet doctrine and equipment. But by 1991, the Soviet system lacks the resources, the institutional stability, and the time to implement major changes. The economy is contracting. The political system is fracturing. The Union itself is dissolving. The window for adaptation has closed. Victor watches this process with the specific frustration of someone who can see the technical problems clearly, but lacks the power to fix them. He could, if given resources and authority, contribute to developing better systems. But the resources aren't available. The authority structures are collapsing. And increasingly, the question isn't how to make Soviet systems better. It's whether there will be a Soviet Union at all. December 1991. The Soviet Union officially dissolves. Victor is now a citizen of the Russian Federation, still in the same apartment, still in the same city, but living in a different country, with a different system and a different future. The defense institutes where he worked continue to exist, but funding is sporadic. Projects are cancelled. Colleagues emigrate or shift to commercial work. The entire apparatus of Soviet military development, already revealed as inadequate by the Gulf War, now largely ceases to function. Over the following years, Victor watches what happens to Soviet-era military technology in the international market. The systems that were once sources of pride, the systems he helped develop, become bargain basement alternatives for nations that can't afford American equipment. The pricing tells its own story. An S-300 system that the Soviets might have valued at $50 million sells for a fraction of that on the export market. Not because Russian salespeople are bad at negotiating, because after the Gulf War everyone knows the actual capabilities. The mystique is gone. The fear that Soviet air defenses inspired in NATO planners has evaporated. What remains is just the hardware, impressive in some technical specifications, but operationally irrelevant against first-tier opponents. Victor lives through the 1990s, a decade of chaos and transformation for Russia. The defense sector that employed him shrinks dramatically. Some of his colleagues find work in the commercial sector. Some emigrate to Western countries. Some simply retire into poverty as the Russian economy struggles. Victor himself continues working, though on reduced salary and increasingly uncertain projects. He watches as Russia attempts to reform its military, an effort hampered by lack of funds, institutional resistance, and the sheer scale of obsolescence that needs to be addressed. He watches as America enjoys its moment of unipolar dominance, the sole superpower with military capabilities no other nation can match. He watches as the lessons of the Gulf War get absorbed by militaries around the world, as stealth technology proliferates, as precision-guided munitions become standard, as information networks become central to military operations. Everything the Gulf War demonstrated becomes doctrine. And he watches as Russia, successor to the Soviet Union, struggles to keep pace. New systems are developed, the S-400 as successor to the S-300, improved aircraft, better electronics. But the gap established in the 1980s and revealed in 1991 takes decades to close, if it closes at all, because the Gulf War wasn't just about specific technologies, it was about systemic capability, the ability of a society to innovate, develop, test, produce and field advanced military systems at scale. American dominance in the Gulf War wasn't because they had one or two wonder weapons. It was because they had comprehensive advantage across every domain of warfare. Here's what the Gulf War teaches about the nature of certainty and expertise. Viktor Petrov was not wrong about radar physics. His understanding of electromagnetic propagation, signal processing, and target tracking was accurate. The mathematics he used were sound. The engineering principles he applied were valid. But he was operating within a framework of assumptions about what was possible, what adversaries would do, what future warfare would look like. Those assumptions, shared by his entire professional community, turned out to be wrong. Not slightly wrong, fundamentally, categorically wrong. And the painful truth is that there was no way for Viktor to know this from within the Soviet system. He had no access to American stealth development. He had no visibility into American testing programs. He had no opportunity to collaborate with international researchers who might have challenged his assumptions. The system he worked within provided expertise, but not truth. It provided skill, but not wisdom. It provided confidence, but not accuracy. This is the danger of expertise in isolated systems. You can become very good at doing the wrong thing. You can solve problems precisely that turn out not to be the actual problems you'll face. You can build elegant solutions to scenarios that never occur. And because you're surrounded by other experts who share your frameworks and assumptions, you have no mechanism for recognizing the error until reality forces the recognition. Think about the moment Viktor sat in his apartment watching CNN. Watching S-300 systems fail to engage F-117 stealth fighters. That moment represents the collision between belief and evidence, between institutional certainty and measurable reality, between what should be true and what demonstrably is true. In that moment, Viktor faced a choice that every expert eventually faces. He could reject the evidence, find reasons to discount what he was seeing, protect his worldview by explaining away the anomalies, or he could accept the evidence, acknowledge that his understanding was incomplete, admit that the framework he operated within was flawed. The first choice is psychologically easier, but intellectually dishonest. The second choice is painful but necessary for growth. Viktor chose acceptance. Not immediately, not easily, but eventually. He allowed reality to reshape his understanding rather than reshaping reality to fit his understanding. This makes him unusual. Most people, particularly experts who have invested decades in mastery of their fields, cannot make this transition. The psychological cost is too high. The threat to identity is too severe. They retreat into denial, into conspiracy theories, into blame shifting, into anything that preserves their sense that their expertise remains valid and valuable. The broader lesson extends beyond military technology. The Soviet Union built an entire society on the premise that scientific socialism could outperform democratic capitalism, that centralized planning could beat market chaos. That ideological commitment could generate better results than individualist motivation. These weren't just political claims, they were hypotheses about how human societies function, how economies develop, how innovation happens. The Soviet leadership believed these hypotheses with the same certainty Viktor believed in Soviet air defense superiority. And they were wrong for similar reasons. They operated within a closed system that prevented genuine testing of their assumptions. They measured success by metrics that confirmed their worldview. They suppressed evidence that contradicted their theories. They confused control for capability, organization for effectiveness, impressive plans for actual achievement. The Gulf War, coming as it did just months before the Soviet collapse, served as final evidence that the hypotheses had failed. The society that claimed to represent the future had been surpassed by the society it claimed was in decline. Viktor Petrov lives into the 21st century. He watches Russia attempt to rebuild military capability. He sees some successes, new systems that incorporate lessons from American technology, attempts to develop Russian stealth fighters, and improved air defense networks. He also sees the limitations, the constraints imposed by smaller budgets and a less robust technological base. He watches the mythology of Soviet military power get partially rehabilitated in Russian nationalism, a process that makes him uncomfortable because he knows the actual history. But he also gains perspective. He understands that the Soviet Union's military failures were symptoms of larger systemic problems, that a society that couldn't produce quality consumer goods was unlikely to produce quality military systems, that an economy that couldn't efficiently make shoes couldn't efficiently make fighter aircraft, that a political system that demanded ideological conformity couldn't foster the kind of innovation that military technology requires. These realizations come slowly, over years of reflection, but they change how Victor understands his own career. He stops seeing himself as someone who failed, and starts seeing himself as someone who was set up to fail by a system that couldn't succeed. The story of Viktor Petrov watching S-300 systems fail on CNN is ultimately a story about truth, about the difference between what we're told and what is, about the gap between institutional belief and measurable reality, about what happens when certainty collides with evidence. In the Soviet system, truth was supposed to be whatever served the revolution, whatever advanced socialism, whatever the party said it was. This approach worked fine when truth was about political loyalty or ideological purity, but it failed catastrophically when truth was about whether missiles could hit aircraft, whether armor could stop shells, whether military doctrine reflected how wars would actually be fought. Because physical reality doesn't care about ideology. Radar cross-sections don't care about dialectical materialism. Weapons accuracy doesn't care about the party line. And eventually, inevitably, systems built on ideological truth rather than empirical truth encounter reality. The encounter is never gentle. For Victor, reality arrived in the form of CNN broadcasts showing his life's work rendered obsolete by an adversary his system had taught him to underestimate. For the Soviet Union as a whole, reality arrived in multiple forms: economic stagnation, political dysfunction, nationalist fragmentation, and yes, military obsolescence demonstrated in the deserts of Iraq. The lesson, if there is one, is about the necessity of honest assessment, about building systems that can acknowledge failure, learn from mistakes, adapt to new realities, about the danger of confusing confidence with competence, impressive specifications with actual performance, institutional authority with expertise, about the critical importance of testing beliefs against evidence rather than filtering evidence through beliefs. The Soviet Union failed this test. Viktor Petrov, watching from his Moscow apartment as the certainties of his career collapsed on television, understood this failure in ways that perhaps only someone who lived through it could understand. Years later, in interviews and conversations, Victor would be asked what he felt in those moments watching CNN. His answer was always precise and honest. He felt the bottom falling out of his understanding of the world. He felt the weight of wasted years. He felt anger at a system that had lied to itself so comprehensively that even its engineers believed the lies. But he also felt, strange as it sounds, a kind of relief. Because doubt is exhausting. Maintaining belief in the face of accumulating evidence is psychological labor. And in that moment, when the evidence became undeniable, when the S-300 system sat silent and useless while American aircraft ruled the skies, Victor could stop pretending. He could stop defending the indefensible. He could acknowledge what part of him had perhaps suspected for years: that the Soviet Union had lost the technological race, that the sacrifices had purchased illusion, that the certainty was false. Truth, even painful truth, even catastrophic truth, is ultimately less corrosive than sustained denial. This is what Victor learned watching the Gulf War. Not just that Soviet systems were inferior, though they were, but that acknowledging inferiority, accepting failure, confronting hard truths about your own limitations, these things are necessary for growth. The Soviet Union could never do this. It collapsed under the weight of its own accumulated lies. Victor survived because he could.